Hi, everyone. This is Jason Barrack of Wall Street for Main Street. Welcome back to another Wall Street for Main Street podcast interview. Today's special guest is a returning guest, and I consider him a mentor and a good friend of mine. He's the best-selling author of Crisis Investing and a couple other books on investing and speculation. He is the international man. He's traveled to over 100 countries. He's a famous speculator, and he's the co-founder of Casey Research, a Stansberry research company now. Doug Casey, thank you for joining me again.
It's a pleasure to be here, Jason. And your introduction was accurate, except that it's over 155 countries, I think, at the moment. But a distinction without an important difference at this point.
Yeah, sorry, Doug. I didn't know the exact number, so I just went with the general one of over 100 to be safe.
All right.
Well, Doug, I want to get your thoughts on this. You know, the studies that are coming out the last couple years are that most adult Americans hate capitalism and prefer socialism. But when I talk to a lot of Americans that say they hate capitalism, they can't even give me a proper definition of what capitalism even is. Why do you think all of this is happening?
I think it's happening because people don't think, they feel. And they conflate and they confuse their feelings with thoughts. Socialism is a very easy sell from a feeling point of view because everything is unicorns and puppy dogs and free medical care, maybe free housing if you need it, free food if you need it, free schooling. Everything's free. And it seems wonderful. It's like living in the cornucopia when you listen to these people talk. And capitalism is a very hard sell. It's an intellectual sell. It's an economic sell. The fact that it actually produces absolutely everything worth having in the way of goods and services, people don't think about that because they feel for an occasional unemployed worker or bankrupt company or something like that. So, of course, we're losing the battle at this point. And it actually leads me to question the actual nature of human nature, that something as perverse as this, where most people hate capitalism or think they hate it. I mean, it's like they don't even watch the news as to what's happening in Venezuela, or for that matter, Zimbabwe before that, or the Soviet bloc before that, or China before that. I don't know what's to be done about it, Jason. It's an intellectual war we're fighting, but people don't think, they feel. So perhaps we're fated to be losers in this.
And it seems there's always excuses for the socialists or the communists that, oh, it didn't work that time, in Venezuela or in Mao China or in the Soviet Union because of this, and this is what we can do better, and this is why we should try again. I hear that all the time as well. But, the funny thing is, I think, it's a lot of Americans are basically brainwashed, and, they go to government schools through young ages, and then they get brainwashed by Hollywood and the mainstream media, and then they go to university and they think, they're learning all these valuable things, and maybe, some of them like math and science are valuable, but some of the other things they're learning are not valuable at all. They're actually hurting themselves as adults and their ability to be successful as adults.
Well, you're absolutely correct. I mean, ever since I appeared on the Phil Donahue show, which in its day was the Oprah of that era, and I told people that they shouldn't send their kids off to college. It was at best a misallocation of 4 years of time and a lot of money. I got booed by the audience. This is like something that people are programmed to believe. You must go to college if you possibly can. It's ridiculous. It's a corrupting influence. It's living in the room for more than 4 years, and you're paying to be corrupted. In fact, you're paying to become an indentured servant, as expensive as it is today. No, that's look, the the cultural Marxists control academia completely. There are 6,000 universities in this country. Almost all of them are run by cultural Marxists, all the administrators and the teachers. So forget about that. Hollywood is totally controlled by cultural Marxists. Forget about that. So everywhere you turn, the media, totally controlled by these people. And the average guy who's just living his own life kind of believes in good faith what he's told by his educators and the media. So it doesn't look like a good outcome at the moment, especially now with the economy finally heading out of the eye of the hurricane. It's lasted much longer than I thought it would, the artificial good times.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you about that. Since you travel a lot more than me, based on your travels the last few years, how well is the global economy doing in your opinion?
Well, you know, there is cause for optimism. And there are two things that I want to mention that can't be overemphasized. Number one, everybody, even people that have been corrupt in the welfare system, we're basically like squirrels. We know we have to produce more than we consume and save the difference. Because if you don't save the difference, you're going to starve to death when winter comes, like a grasshopper. So this is inbred over hundreds of thousands of years in humans, got to produce and save the difference. So that fact helps to have capital grow and means that the standard of living gradually goes up. Point number one. Point number two is there are more scientists and engineers alive today that have lived in all of Earth's history together. And they're innovating fantastic things using the capital that other people save. So, yeah, why things generally get better and why it's good to do not reasons. That said, there is a thing called the business cycle, which is basically created by fiat money. And at this stage in the business cycle, we saw entering a gigantic hurricane, or we entered it in 2007. And we went through the leading edge in 2008 and 2009. It's a big hurricane. It's a big eye of the storm. And I think even as we speak, I mean, I thought this was going to happen a couple of years ago, but it hasn't yet. We're going to go into the trailing edge of the hurricane, and it's going to be, as 2008 and 9 were, you'll recall, this is going to be much, much worse, much, much different, and also much longer lasting. So there's a reason to be concerned.
Yeah, I don't see that the global economy, when I look at the economic data, is doing very well. I see, a lot of these global central banks, whether they're the Bank of Japan, the European Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England. Since the 2008 global financial crisis, they've added over $18 trillion in money and credit out of thin air to their balance sheets to buy up asset prices. That was money that obviously I'm not in favor of central planning, but that was money that could have been spent on, improving the infrastructure in the United States. Instead, it went to basically bank bailouts and other ridiculous things to knock up asset prices. But, I think there's a lot of my listeners out there who don't think that there's any capitalism left. But I think if you're in the United States and you're kind of middle class, either in the middle class or right below it, you basically are forced to be a capitalist because you have to work hard, make ends meet with a paycheck. You have to save some money. And if you don't, there's not a bailout waiting for you. So I think, people, whether they realize it or not, are basically being forced to be capitalists, but a lot of people don't realize it.
Well, that is correct. I guess a bigger question is, what should the average guy do right now to improve the standard of living as quickly as possible? And I would urge everybody and anybody to try to be an entrepreneur, which is what being a capitalist is all about. And how are you an entrepreneur? You've got to figure out what goods and services other people want. Because I personally, and I think you too, and probably everybody listening, has an almost infinite desire for goods and services. I want a Ferrari. Maybe I want a Mercedes Gullwing coupe too. Maybe I want 2 or 3 more houses in nice places. Maybe I want a massage every day. And we all want an infinite number of things. So almost anybody should be working 24 hours a day providing goods and services for other people. The key is this. It's to find goods and services that are valuable enough that you can earn a lot, and making sure that people know that you're there, which is marketing and promotion. So I don't have an awful lot of sympathy for people that are whining about not having enough. They've got to work harder and work smarter. That's what I had to do, and I still do.
And yet, there's people like there's Parasites, because I think, the economy that we have now, Doug, has been changed over the decades. It's been changed by the political entrepreneur class, as Murray Rothbard would call it, in Washington, D.C., on Wall Street. So it's built by parasites for parasites, where they don't have to do that hard work, like you said, the delayed gratification, the working extra hours or taking extra sleep. They could just make a phone call to the Federal Reserve, or they can make a phone call up their lobbyists, and their lobbyists can talk to a congressman or 2 or 3 and hook them up. So
no, you're right, Jason. That's why, especially in the last few decades, the rich have been getting much richer, and the poor have been getting poorer, and the middle class has been getting smaller, just because of what you said. The distribution of wealth has been politicized, and the politicization of the economy, everybody looking at the government and the government getting bigger and bigger, has created lots of distortions and misallocations of capital in society, and more of the wealth of society goes to the government first to be reallocated by these parasites. So yeah, no, you're quite correct.
Yeah, there are so many, as you know, Doug, since we've had dinner around here, there's so many Wesley Mouse types here in the Washington, D.C. metro area that, they make $150,000 a year. Some of them don't even go into work more than once a month, and they can't be fired. And they complain that they don't make enough money and how hard they work. I've met some military contractors that were bragging to me that literally they made $250,000 a year and didn't even have to go to work. So, and I could go on and on about all these crazy stories about how much government waste and corruption and fraud there is here. But literally, Doug, I think we've gotten to the point where, we're trillions and trillions in debt. And I don't think this system can go on forever, because I think, the parasite is basically at this point killing the host. It's as large, if not larger, than the host itself. The parasite has gotten so big and so bloated. I mean, look at how much money and credit the central banks have had to take on. Because, the last financial crisis in 2008, that crisis was the banking system, right? And look, the governments and the central banks had to absorb all the waste. And so who's going to bail out the governments and the central banks now that they've absorbed all the waste from the last crisis?
Well, yes, who is going to bail them out? There's an excellent chance that people that have money in their banks over the insured amount, which is $250,000 per account, they may wind up being bailed in instead of the banks being bailed out. This happened in Cyprus several years ago. Everybody that had over 100,000 euros in their account basically lost that money. And the government of Cyprus rationalized it by saying, well, it's important to defend the little people, so the big people just have to lose their money. Of course, the real big people never kept money in Cypriot, Cypriot pounds, or do they call them drachmas? I forget. I spent a week there. But they have businesses, they have land, they have stocks, they have overseas accounts. So, but that's actually quite likely to happen in this country. The government is going to confiscate more real wealth from some people in this country to bail out the favored political classes. It's inevitable. Right now, the acknowledged debt of the U.S. is about $20 trillion. If you count unacknowledged debt, other obligations, guarantees, and so forth, it's actually Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all this type of thing, and much more. It's more like $200 trillion. And the national debt right now, the average interest rate being paid on it is only like 2.5%. It's all financed short term. If interest rates go back to just normal levels, all of the tax revenue that the U.S. government collects won't even pay the interest bill. And that's exactly what you said before. This may be close to the last cycle before this blows up in an ugly way. If they have to borrow to pay interest, it's just about game over.
And that's why central banks are manipulating interest rates for the most part lower, although the Federal Reserve did a couple token quarter point interest rate hikes. The other thing, Doug, if I can add to your points there, is the Pentagon is missing over $6.5 trillion from its budget. So, I mean, there's literally trillions of dollars leaking out, spent on God knows what, spent on God knows what over the years. So, I mean, there's so much waste and fraud. I could spend hours, just talking with you about all the people at different government agencies who've listened to this podcast and come to me off the record saying, Jason, I work at this government agency. You should see all the stuff that goes on around here. It's really unbelievable. If you try to do your job, if you want to be like an efficient government bureaucrat a lot of times, and you don't want to see waste or corruption, you're run out of there. That's how crazy things have gotten at this point. And the Department of Justice, Doug, this is not necessarily monetarily, but we've gotten to the point now where basically Eric Holder, before he left as Attorney General, he was telling people to ignore, blatant fraud that would have decades ago put, corporate CEOs or management teams or bankers in prison. And he was told, we know there's fraud. We know it was lots of it, lots of felonies. We can't prosecute any bankers and put them in jail, even though we know they committed felonies, because it could potentially collapse the financial system again. So that type of fragility, when you add all these examples of the amount of waste and corruption and fraud, I think that means we don't have that much time left.
And I'm afraid that although Trump is actually doing some good things, he's trying to get rid of a lot of supernumerary government employees and so forth. But I'm afraid it's going to collapse on his watch. And that's kind of a pity, because he's associated, for better or worse, incorrectly mostly, because he doesn't have any personal philosophy or views. He's kind of associated with the free market, certainly relative to people like Hillary or Bernie Sanders. So when it all collapses on his watch, once again, capitalism, or what passes for capitalism in the U.S., is going to take a big hit. And I'll make a prediction now. I predicted that Trump was going to win, and I actually won money. I placed bets on that. But I'll make another prediction now. It's that in the next election, in 2020, I think we're going to get a left-wing general. And the reason I say that, it'll be left-wing because the right wing, which is kind of in control right now, is going to be discredited. And the only thing people trust in this country is the military. Now, this is misplaced trust, but nonetheless, it's a fact. So I'll bet you we get an ex-general of the left-wing variety, ex-president.
So you think then that they would be still neocon with their foreign policy, but they would be more like communist or socialist or Marxist?
Exactly. Exactly. They're going to do all kinds. Look, whenever anything goes wrong, certainly when the economy goes bad, people scream to the government, do something, as if they should. They shouldn't, of course. So, sure, and especially somebody that's been in the military that believes in dirigiste policies, giving orders and making things happen, looking at 300 million citizens as privates in an army, sure, he'll give orders. So, yeah, I think so. And we'll keep up an aggressive foreign policy. How not with soldiers in over 100 countries around the world? I mean, God forbid they set off a major war not just the kind of sport wars that we've been having in Iraq and Afghanistan. So, no, I think it's going to be kind of ugly.
That's almost like some of the bad characters besides Leslie Mouch in Atlas Shrugged and Ayn Rand. So maybe she was just quite a few decades early with some of her predictions of some of the craziness that's already happening.
Well, science fiction has long been a much better predictor of the future than any think tanks that live around the Beltway in Washington. And Rand was. I mean, she was quite accurate, even for her time, and when she wrote that book in the 50s. But she's much more accurate now than she was even then. But I've taken up writing fiction myself because you can say a lot of things in the form of fiction that you probably shouldn't say in the form of nonfiction. And also, you reach a somewhat different audience with fiction than you do with nonfiction. So I don't think I'm going to do any more nonfiction books. I'm going to do just fiction. And the second one's just been released in the series that I'm working on now.
Yeah, I read your first book in the High Ground series, Speculator. I thought that was excellent. I read that a couple months ago on Audible audiobook. I thought it was great. You developed an interesting main character in Charles Knight, who's I don't think he didn't go to college, or he's a college dropout, and then he starts to make it on his own as an entrepreneur and speculator, and then all these crazy things happen around him.
Well, exactly. I have Charles Knight, who's 23 years old at the time, and doesn't have any money. He works, saves his money. He makes a small investment in a mining company. He's got a property in Africa, and stock goes way up. He unexpectedly becomes a millionaire, decides he better get on a plane and see if there's anything there. Finds a mining fraud, gets involved in a bush war with child soldiers and all that, and turns his million into 200 million, and the government steals it all from him. So that's the plot line of Speculator, which is available on Amazon, of course. And now, 7 years later, Charles, after spending 7 years traveling the world, which, incidentally, some advice to anybody listening, is that if you possibly can, get out of the serf-like medieval village where you're living, wherever it is, and do something different from everybody else. And the best thing to do is to hit the road everywhere. Go everywhere in the world. Meet new people, see new things, gain new experiences. Much more important than anything else. Anyway, Charles does that for 7 years, comes back and decides to get into the drug business. And I've known a lot of people in the drug business, legal and illegal. So Drug Lord, which is the second book in the series, explains the legal and illegal aspects of the drug business, how you do it, the effects of drugs, how to deal with the FDA and the DEA, among other things. So it's actually, I'm told, a better book than Speculator. So I urge people to read it. They're in for a very interesting time with that book.
Is the main bad character from the first book, the evil, beautiful woman, government bureaucrat? I thought she was a well-designed character. The antagonist, is she back in there?
Yes, she is, and she survives, but some very interesting things happen to her when we take her back to Africa. A lot of this book is in the United States, but we go back to Africa as well. So it's this book, like all of the books in the High Ground series, is a morality tale, separating the good guys from the bad guys. And in the book that we're working on now, which will be published this time next year, is Assassin, which will go into the techniques and the objectives of the assassin's trade, and especially the morality of the assassin's trade, and also the history. There have been a lot of assassinations in history, and it's usually the bad guys that are made to look like the good guys. So I think I'm going to like Assassin even more than I do Speculator and Drug Lord.
So you mentioned how the bad guys look like the good guys and the good guys look like the bad guys. I think that's exactly a short summary of what happened in the first book, Speculator. We have the government supposed to be, people have this kind of Disneyland view of government that the government employees and the bureaucrats are hardworking, underpaid, thankless, when in actuality they're corrupt, conniving. In a lot of cases, in reality, here in DC, they're making twice the salary that the average private sector entry-level employee is making, and the government employee can't get fired, and the government employee can commit a felony. So,
of course, and it's worse than that, because then when they're collecting their pensions, then they can retail their connections and so forth at the agency they used to work in for big bucks to corporations. So you're absolutely right. It's completely criminal, and I'd point out that at this stage especially, government doesn't draw the so-called best and brightest. It draws the worst kind of people that are professional busybodies that like to control other people as opposed to control physical reality. So government is much more of a snake pit now than it's ever been in the past.
Yeah, I think that's an accurate description. And your second high ground fiction book, Drug Lord, is available on Kindle, paperback, and recently it was just released on Audible audiobook. I have it. I haven't listened to it yet, but I'm sure it's going to be very good. Last couple questions before I let you go. Did you speculate on Bitcoin, Ethereum, any of the altcoins or initial coin offerings?
That's a good question, Jason. I first was introduced to Bitcoin in Cafayate, Argentina, where I have a development. And a young Belgian guy named Tour de Meester, I bought him lunch, and he thanked me and gave me a Bitcoin. They were $13 at the time. He said, look, I want to give you this. It's a physical Bitcoin, which exists, incidentally. They're collectibles, kind of. You can put it on the Internet with the codes around it. I was introduced to it a long time ago, but I wasn't a believer because I felt that Bitcoin... it's a good medium of exchange, but is it a store of value, and is it really useful? So even though I knew about it early, I've only gotten involved in it fairly recently, which I feel bad about because it's the bubble stage now. I mean, these things, everybody knows about it. The public's getting involved in it in a big way. It's about to get regulated. So to answer your question, yeah, I'm involved in it. I'm doing things with it in a number of different ways. I think that it's a fantastic thing, the whole blockchain technology, probably the biggest thing that's come out since the Internet itself. But there are people that have made scores of millions, hundreds of millions, billions on these cryptocurrencies. I think it may be a little bit too late to hope to do that. But, yeah, I'm playing around with it.
Yeah, I speculated on Ethereum. I bought some last year, and I pulled out early. But rationally, this thing went a lot higher than I expected it to. I made tenfold gains on some of my coin speculation, but it went a lot higher than that. But I'm a contrarian value investor. I've been following your work for years, you and Jim Rogers. So I also like I like real things. I prefer them. I admit Bitcoin and blockchain technology are amazing technology. But I am wary of putting, a lot of my money into Bitcoin and these other cryptocurrencies. I would prefer to be diversified and at least have either some or more money, more of my capital in things like gold, silver, and mining shares instead.
Yes, and recently I've become friends with John McAfee, who's a very sound libertarian as well as being a very interesting, fun guy. And he's coming out with his own currency. It's going to be called McAfee coin. And it's going to be very big in China. So maybe I'll do something with that on the ICO. And John is of the opinion that Bitcoin is going to $50,000 per token. I don't know about that. But it certainly serves a useful purpose because Bitcoin makes it possible to transfer money across borders, even though there may be foreign exchange controls and so forth. And in places like Venezuela, people are starting to use Bitcoin instead of their worthless currency. And so this is going to be a bigger and bigger element in the years to come with these cryptocurrencies. So I'm favorably inclined towards them. It's just that they're just becoming such a bubble at this point.
Yeah, they've gone up so much already, but the people I interview in the Bitcoin crypto space say it's just getting started. I'm very skeptical of that because of how much they've already gone up. Something that's already gone up 40. There was an initial coin offering, Doug, that raised $25 million in July, and only a couple months later, it already has $1 billion valuation. So 40-fold gains in 2 months, from 25 million to over 1 billion. So that doesn't sound like something that's hated, contrarian, undervalued, unloved to me.
No, it's starting to look very much like the internet stocks did back in the late 90s. So, and when they do an ICO, the question is, okay, where's that money go that people are buying, in many cases, the coins on the ICO for? I don't know.
Well, the ICO is supposed to be, instead of the traditional angel investing in venture capital, so it's skipping that. It's skipping the amount of the middlemen and excess fees that Silicon Valley venture capitalists and Wall Street lawyers and investment bankers would have gotten. But there is a lot of fraud there. I interviewed Adam B. Levine, who's been in Bitcoin since 2013. And he said that even he got defrauded recently. He was a little lazy researching one of the initial coin offerings, and it was a good fraud. So they had set up, the people who were doing the fraud had set up a good web page, and they had copy and pasted like legit technology computer programmers profiles from LinkedIn. And he said as soon as they raised the money, they deleted everything within a couple hours.
Yeah, I'm sure there's going to be lots of that type of stuff going on. And, of course, that then becomes an open invitation to the government to regulate it, and that's going to increase the costs. And, of course, the government's going to stick its dirty fingers into this. In fact, I suspect that the government is going to come out with its own Bitcoin version of the dollar. Maybe they'll call it FedCoin or something like that as an alternative version of the dollar, because, of course, they want to get rid of cash, starting with $100 bills and $50 bills. And since most people have smartphones now, I think the government's going to come out with its own kind of cryptocurrency, but I wouldn't use it, of course.
To add to your point there, Ken Rogoff of Reinhardt and Rogoff, he actually wrote a book last year. It was called The Curse of Cash, and he was arguing for a cashless society. I think you have Lawrence Summers, the corrupt Larry Summers, the guy at Harvard University, and involved with the Treasury Department over the years. I think he was one of the main guys who repealed Glass-Steagall, and he's been calling for a cashless society. What I'm worried about, Doug, I think you touched on it there, is that this blockchain technology in, an entrepreneur's hands in the private sector, there's a lot of beneficial uses for someone who's in Venezuela, if you're having your currency hyperinflated, but there's also with technology the potential for government to weaponize it. So this technology can be hijacked, and then this is basically a central planner's wet dream for a cashless society where, they can ban cash, they can make you a felon then for using gold or silver, in saving or investing in gold or silver, or even paying with cash, and they can track and tax every single transaction then to say, oh, well, how come you spent this amount of money, but your income only says this? So, I think that's where things are headed.
You're right. It used to be that criminal-type personalities would join or form their own mafias of one type or another. But increasingly, criminal-type personalities are drawn to the government because there's much more power and much more money, and it's much safer in the government than there is in any type of mafia organization.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, you can make the most government employees here at the federal level for right outside of DC, they make like $80,000-$100,000 a year. They can, if they add another degree, a master's or a PhD, even if it's useless, they can still increase their pay scale. So it's one of the easiest places in the United States to make $100,000 a year, and basically you can't get fired unless you commit a felony. And in some cases, Doug, even if you commit a felony, they still can't fire you.
No, it's horrible. I hate going back to Washington. I lived there for 20 years, traveling a lot the whole time, but it's kind of a shameful admission on my part that I say I spent that much time in D.C. Well, it's partially because I grew up in D.C., but I hope your listeners take a lesson from me and stop what you're doing and hit the road and travel and look for big deal opportunities, because you're never going to find the meaning of life or even have the kind of standard of living that you might think about sometimes if you work for a salary for other people, God forbid, for some agency of government.
Yeah, I agree. You have to be willing to take some calculated risks in order to get where you want to go. And if you stay totally in your comfort zone, you're not really going to achieve any of the big picture, any of the really big goals that you have. Are there any markets or countries in specifically that you've seen lately that you think would be potentially a good contrarian speculation or for contrarian investment?
Unfortunately, because all of these governments, not just the U.S. government, but the Europeans, the Japanese, the Chinese, and all these little governments, everybody's been printing up money by the bucket load. So we're kind of in the twilight zone financially. There's really nothing cheap out there right now. So it's very problematical. If I was going to do anything, I would be much more inclined to be short the bond market, short the stock market. The real estate market is floating on a sea of debt, which is based on low interest rates. I'm not interested in real estate. This is one of those times where I can't draw your attention to anything that looks like a bargain. My personal specialty, bailiwick, is mining exploration stocks, the most volatile class of stocks in the world, actually, more volatile than tech stocks are. And actually, commodities have been in a bear market generally since 2011. So they've been in a bear market now for 6 going on 7 years. So I like commodity-related things from that point of view. And I like some of these small mining stocks because they're very, very cheap cyclically. They're about the only part of any of the markets that are cheap. But I don't recommend them to people because they are so risky. But they're about the only thing I can think of that's actually cheap.
Yeah, I think I think it's probably more than $18 trillion that's been created since the 2008 financial crisis. That's all we know about, because it's not like, these central banks are agreeing to independent annual audits. These are just the information numbers that they're voluntarily releasing to us. So these are not, I don't think, the real numbers. From my sources with currency swaps, I think there's been a lot more injected than that. But yeah, I think it's a very difficult time. I think the global economy, you use a hurricane analogy. I like to say, the global economy is one giant economic minefield. And there's all these different landmines, some of them we can see, some of them are bigger than others, some of them are hidden. So I pick your analogy. I think it's pretty accurate with either one.
Yeah, I think that people should try to get their financial houses in order now while things are still relatively mellow out there, because I don't think they're going to stay mellow for long. The odds are overwhelmingly high that we're going to see brutal inflation in this country in the years to come. The major export from the United States has long been dollars. It's not wheat or Boeings or computers. It's dollars. We send dollars abroad in exchange for Sonys and Mercedes and cocaine. And at some point, all those dollars are going to come back to the U.S., and they're going to be bidding for everything in this country. So the standard of living in the U.S. could drop precipitously at some point soon.
Yeah, I think there's a lot worse stagflation coming, Doug. There's trillions in misallocations of capital. We have politicians trying to force, wages higher and, at fast food restaurants and others. And, instead of the total amount of employees staying the same. What the restaurant owners are doing is they're firing the employees, they're reducing more of them to part-time, or they're automating. They're adding like touch screens and robotics instead. And then the coup de grace, which I think is the most dangerous potential thing, one of the most dangerous potential things President Trump can do, is start, a full-out trade war with China. That could, really make everything very expensive. There could potentially be, China could put restrictions on rare earth metals or other things. The U.S. can retaliate. So that's what worries me the most. Do you think also, the other thing I wanted to ask you, last question before I let you go, we talked about this at the beginning of the interview, how most Americans don't even know what capitalism is. Do you think then, if this continues on this path with, people aren't recognizing reality, the main Ayn Rand quote I like to use is, you can ignore reality, but you cannot ignore the consequences of ignoring reality. Do you think then that America, the United States, 10 to 15 years, if things continue the way they are, is headed towards maybe an ideological civil war?
We're on the ragged edge of it right now. I mean, I was around during the late 60s and the early 70s when there were actually quite a number of bombs going off in the country. There were serious riots, really serious, where the National Guard was using 50 caliber M2s to rake buildings in Detroit. I mean, things were out of control in the late 60s and early 70s. And although it hasn't reached that level of violence, from an ideological point of view, from the point of view of people being able to talk to each other, it's much, much more serious than it was back then. So, we're on the ragged edge of a civil war. Now, whether we get one or not, different question, because people are fat, and a quarter or half of the country are on some type of, prescription Prozac or Ritalin or something like that. And people are so deeply in debt, which they weren't back then. They have no flexibility to lose their jobs. They're not going to go rioting in the streets. But this country is not what it used to be. Well, things always change, of course. But the direction that the U.S. is going in is not good.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it's very dystopian. But, Doug, I don't see a lot of other countries that are doing things a lot better, because the U.S. has so much control over so many other countries. I mean, Trump has talked about invading Venezuela. That's terrifying. God knows what could happen in North Korea with the U.S.'s foreign policy there. And we know from WikiLeaks, I think in the last couple of weeks, they released documents. It looks like the North Koreans have been selling nuclear weapons materials to Iran. So that's, that's a potential, another potential scary thing down the line as well.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting over the next few years, which is one reason why I'm happy to be here on my ranch in Colorado, but sometimes I'm even happier to be on another ranch I have in Argentina or in Uruguay, kind of in the middle of nowhere, where if things go sideways here, I'll watch it all, not from out my front window here in Aspen, but on a widescreen in the middle of nowhere in Argentina.
Well, Doug, I always enjoy our conversations. I look forward to talking with you more in the future about the global economy and getting mentorship from you on how to become a better speculator and becoming a great entrepreneur. And I'll attach a link for our listeners to buy your newest fiction book, Drug Lord, in the High Ground series. I
think people are really going to like that book, Jason.
I'm looking forward to reading it. So I haven't gotten to it yet, but I will get to it. I have a couple more. I have one book I have to finish, and then I'll get to this next one, yours, in the next couple weeks. But I appreciate you giving me the book.
Well, and it's a pleasure talking to you as always.
Wall Street for Main Street needs your help. Since the middle of 2016, YouTube continues to increasingly censor and sabotage the growth and success of my channel with dramatically slower or no subscriber growth, a huge decrease in views per month compared to 2016, and well over $10,000 lost in Google AdSense revenues the last 18 months. I should have been way over 20,000 subscribers and way over 3 million views last year, but it feels like I am Sisyphus trying to roll a heavier boulder with more and more additional weight up a steeper and steeper hill. In the last few weeks, all of my videos have been set to demonetization by default, and I have to manually protest each video. This is in addition to even lower than usual Google AdSense revenues after the adpocalypse started over a year ago for me. This has also affected my ability to get paid advertisers to agree to deals not involving YouTube, as I lost $3,000 per month in paid advertising deals at the end of June 2017 because all my analytics are down a lot thanks to YouTube censorship algorithms that have intentionally kneecapped the growth of my channel. With YouTube/Google/Alphabet /Don't Be Evil strongly considering demonetizing or setting all libertarian, conservative, or pro-Trump content to private to prevent any sharing or monetization, it is imperative I have a contingency plan to figure out how to make a living off my content. Each 30 to 40 minute video takes a few hours of my time before it's released to the public. There's a strong possibility that in the near future, YouTube will force me to move all or almost all my content to a new video upload website that allows free speech or behind a paywall on my own website. Thanks if you have already made a one-time or recurring monthly donation, and thanks in advance for any future donations as I decide the future of my channel and what to do with my content going forward. We accept one-time donations on the Wall Street for Main Street website via PayPal, Bitcoin, or Gold Money. You can also become a monthly Patreon contributor for $1 or more a month if you want to help me out. And don't forget to like each video on YouTube and share it with your friends and family if you think they would like the content.